Many states want to make it easier for families to homeschool, yet some homeschool families are vocally opposed to this. Let's find out why. Welcome to Sharpening Arrows, where we train teens to think biblically about life and politics. I'm your host, Victor Jakes. Now, this is a unique podcast. Parents, I encourage you to listen with your teen or preteen, put it on the speaker, share an AirPod, listen together. We are going to talk about ideas. We're going to look at both sides of ideas, and this is important. One of the best ways to know that you are firm in your beliefs is to be able to articulate the beliefs of people who disagree with you. And if you want to watch, we are on YouTube, youtube.com/@sharpening-arrows, youtube.com/@sharpening-arrows. All right, let's have a pause point. That's another unique part of this podcast. Parents, I encourage you to actually stop the podcast. I know it's an odd thing for a podcast host to say, but press pause and discuss these questions together. Is it okay to disagree with a friend? Now, perhaps when I was growing up, the answer to this would be obvious. Yes, of course, it's okay to disagree. It's normal. I think some of that has been lost in today's culture where, you either are 100% with someone or you're 100% against someone, and there's nowhere in between. And I disagree with that. You can disagree with someone and work together on other things. You can disagree with someone and actually gain information from them, use something that they say to learn something new about a topic or to refine your argument. And I find principled disagreement actually to be a very useful thing, much more so than someone just copying someone else's thoughts or telling you what they want to hear. And in life, little news flash, you're going to be around people that you disagree with on something. If you have a brother or sister, if you ever get married, if you are married, you're going to understand that you're going to have disagreements. And one of the most important things when you disagree is working through those disagreements, seeing the disagreement as the problem, not the other person as the problem. All right, anyway, that's enough of that. But the reason I bring that up is because today's topic is a bit unique because it actually divides conservatives, specifically the homeschooled community. And so of all the topics that I've done, I would guess this is the show that I will have the most people disagree with me on. And that's okay. I'm not offended. I've even been wrong before. And if you don't believe me, ask my wife. And if you really don't like me, ask my kids. But we can have disagreements and still be okay. It's okay to disagree. All right, let's have another pause point. How many students are homeschooled? What do you think? Well, this is from the National Home Education Research Institute. It estimated that there were 3.4 million homeschool students, that's between K through 12, during the 24-25 school year. That it was an estimated 6.3% of the school age population. And that was a pretty significant increase over where it was pre-COVID. The U.S. Department of Education estimated it was about 3.3% of school-age children, or about 1.7 million in spring of 2016, although there were some other estimates that put it over 2 million. But regardless, there has been a pretty remarkable increase in homeschooling since COVID. And that's understandable because in many places during COVID, parents were essentially homeschooling and they realized that they could do this. They could do certainly a better job than a teacher talking to disengaged students on a computer screen. Maybe they listened to the lessons and found, oh my word, they're teaching you that? We've got to do something different. All right, so let's take a moment. Anytime we are getting into a topic, it's a good idea to ask question 5 of the Great 8. The Great 8 are the questions that we put in our mental toolbox to examine an issue, and I will list them all later. But question 5 is a very important one. It's, what do you mean by that? Anytime you're having a discussion with someone, I encourage you to define terms not to be nitpicky, but just so you both understand what you're talking about. So let's define this term of homeschooling. Now, today, it's very common to know homeschoolers. I myself, my wife, homeschools most of our children. But going back 50 years ago, in the late 1970s, there were only about 13,000 homeschool students in the entire country. Wow, that's rapid growth. Well, what do we mean by this? Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it as to teach school subjects to one's children at home. And I would just define it myself as where parents have direct primary responsibility for a child's education, with much of the school happening at home or directly controlled by the parents. And the reason I say that is because if you've been around homeschoolers, you likely know this, that it's hard to give a one clear definition of homeschooling because, well, there's online school, or there's video lessons for school, there's co-ops that parents use. And so I like this idea that parents are directing the education and have primary responsibility for it. And again, that's not to knock anyone who goes to public school or to private school. I have a couple of my kids going to Christian school. I'm really grateful for that. But I don't have direct primary responsibility for their day-to-day education the way that we do with our children who homeschool. All right, so let's ask another pause point question. Why don't more parents homeschool? Victor, you've just talked about how great it is. It's a way to directly train and up your children in the way they should go in moral instruction and Christian instruction, but also in academics. There's more tools than ever to do it. So why don't more parents do it? Well, there's some practical reasons. Sometimes both parents work. Some families have only a single parent at home, and that parent needs to work in order to provide food and shelter, the basics. Homeschooling can be more work. That is definitely more work than sending your kid to a more formal school setting. Some kids, it's just better for them to be in that more formal school setting. As I said, we've got kids, and some of my own kids go to a Christian school. And for some parents, it's the cost. It costs money to homeschool, especially if you start doing those co-ops or online schools. All right, so that's a kind of a long way of leading into our topic today, which is, should homeschoolers support school choice? Okay, again, let's go to question 5. Let's talk about school choice. And to do that, to define that term, I'm actually going to give some background. So over the last several decades, public schools, where the vast majority of students are still educated, have been generally terrible. Okay, if you go back a couple episodes, we talked about how we can make broad statements, even if there are specific examples where that's not true. There are some terrific public schools. There are some awesome, terrific, godly public school teachers. And thank you for what you do. It is a ministry. Okay, those things are true, and we can make a generalization. Okay, that's how we have to talk about things when there are tens of millions of people involved. We have to make generalizations, understanding, of course, that there are exceptions. Okay, so as a whole, public education has been terrible. It's been terrible in a couple of respects. It's been terrible academically. If you look at public schools in Nevada, less than 50% of third graders in my state are proficient in reading. Less than 40% are proficient in math. So they aren't doing well academically. And perhaps even worse, they aren't instructing students up in virtue, certainly not Christianity. But many students come out of high school not being able to read or do basic math, but also hating America. The values that have been taught, inculcated in public school students, are extremely destructive for both the individual and society at large. And there's lots of reasons for this. And again, in my failed attempt to keep this podcast to 20 minutes, I am not going to go into these too in depth, but there was a very systematic effort by Marxists to go into schools of education, capture the schools of education, and teach new teachers to capture the teacher pipeline and to teach them all of these Marxist ideas and this Marxist ideology. And they have teachers, again, not all teachers, but many teachers, many school systems, many textbooks have brought these into the public school system, leading to students who both don't do a very good job at learning, and the things that they do learn are oftentimes destructive values. And so the conservative response to this has been, okay, let's try school choice. We trust parents much more than anyone at a school because parents know their children best. Let's take a portion of the money that that taxpayers already spend on education and give it to parents. And this started off with vouchers, where parents could receive a voucher, or basically a coupon, and go to a private school and say, hey, I have this voucher to help pay for tuition here. There's another type of program called a tuition tax credit program that mechanically works a little differently, but accomplishes the same goal. Well, several years ago, there was a new form of school choice, an improved form called education savings account. And the idea behind that was, okay, well, instead of giving the parents money that they can only spend at one school, there's all these different types of educational resources and options. Let's take that portion of money that taxpayers would have spent on a public education, put it in a use-restricted account. That's what education savings account. And then parents can determine how that money is spent. So yes, they can spend it at a private school, but they can also spend it on tutoring or textbooks or online classes. What is needed to be able to tailor and customize an education for that child? Now maybe you can see where the homeschool comes in, because while vouchers weren't going to be accessible to homeschoolers because vouchers pay for a private school tuition, homeschoolers don't have tuition, an ESA that could be used for curriculum, that could be used for co-ops, that could be used for online classes. Now that is something that could benefit a homeschooling family. And another great thing about ESAs is that if you don't spend all the money, it actually stays in your child's account to be used for future years, or in some states, I believe, it can even be applied to an in-state college. So you're awarded for being frugal with the money. All right, the benefits for homeschoolers on the surface is that this would allow more parents to homeschool, right? If cost was holding you back from homeschooling, all of a sudden you can pay for homeschool expenses. But probably the most important homeschool organization in the country, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, opposes ESAs and especially opposes homeschoolers using ESAs. All right, as we always do on this podcast, we're going to start with arguments for the side that I personally disagree with. And remember, if you disagree with me, it's okay. I will not be offended. All right, so the HSLDA, great organization, terrific organization, has done a lot for the homeschooling movement. It's done a lot for homeschooling families like mine. I'm extremely grateful for them. They object to ESAs for a couple of reasons. Let's start with this. They say that ESAs invite government regulations. The argument is that, well, once you start taking government money, people are going to want to know how that money is spent. And so you're inviting the government to come in and basically audit parents and potentially say, yeah, no, we don't like this. What? You teach that marriage is between a man and a woman? Oh, no, we can't have this. And so you're inviting regulations on homeschool parents. This is James Mason, president of HSLDA, writing in 2018. I suspect that eventually good government sorts will want stricter accounting along the lines of my medical flex account, and eventually ideologues will try to justify legislative proposals like Professor Reich's, this is an anti-homeschooling professor that he had referenced earlier in the piece, in exchange for ESA money. Okay, so you can see James Mason, president of HSLDA, laying this out, right? Well, if you take the money, you're going to get the regulations. Even if and again, this is James Mason, even if accepting ESAs were voluntary, how long would it take for state legislators to attach strings to state money, then expect all homeschoolers to toe the mark? Professor Rich, this anti-homeschooling professor, and his allies, remember, would impose additional requirements on homeschoolers, even if no state money were at issue. ESAs would change the equation considerably, as Reich would have a compelling argument for imposing more regulation on homeschooling generally. And an article from the Fordham Institute, November 2025, confirms these fears. It's entitled, "In the Era of ESAs, Who's Watching Homeschooling?" And here's what the Fordham Institute says. Other no-notice, low-regulation states don't require any qualifications for the teacher or instructor in the home environment, have no mandated subjects, or do not require any form of student assessment. Yeah, it's so amazing. I'm just going to take a little aside here, but it's so amazing to see people be like, oh no, that they aren't qualified by the government? How can we be sure that these students are going to be educated? Well, I don't know. Let's go to public schools where everything's qualified by the government and see that the majority of students aren't proficient. Maybe there's a disconnect between, just because the government says it's okay and something actually being okay. All right. Anyway, that's my aside. Going back to the Fordham article. As a result, thousands of students are not necessarily required to learn basic reading or math skills. Again, this is my aside. As compared to public schools where they are required to learn those skills, but they aren't. Amazing. All right, Fordham Foundation. And no specific person or entity is held accountable if they fail to do so. Wait, you mean like public schools? Where no one is held accountable when students fail again and again and again? And in fact, not only are they not held accountable, they get more money because they need more money because they're failing? Okay. Fordham Institute. Even those who value homeschooling should see why this lack of regulation is concerning. No, actually, I don't. The variation of regulations and lack of consistent data makes it nearly impossible to track academic outcomes or enrollment trends, a concern that is only becoming more acute as ESAs and other school choice programs become more popular. All right. And following up again on this objection, this is the HSLDA. They have a great magazine. This is from the 2023 edition of that magazine. How ESA funding could undermine homeschool freedom. Here's what they say. However, we are concerned that ESAs and other tax-funded accounts will provide government officials with a reason to further regulate and oversee homeschooling. The argument for enacting new restrictions could go, and has gone, something like this. Now that homeschool families are receiving government money, the government needs to ensure they are spending that money responsibly. All right, let's have a pause point. Which of the great 8 questions would you use in response to this argument? As a reminder, the great 8 questions are: question 1, what happens next? Question 2, has this been tried before? Question 3, is there a principle involved? Question 4, what are the trade-offs? Question 5, remember this one we've used already, what do you mean by that? Question 6, is this an appeal to emotion or logic? Question 7, am I focused on the speaker or the argument? And question 8, what does the Bible say? And as always, there are lots of ways to go after issues. And if you hear my children in the background fighting, that never happens here. We never have any disagreements at my house. So just pretend it's not happening. There are always lots of ways to attack arguments. And so just because I didn't choose your specific question doesn't mean you are wrong. All right. And I want to actually start with question 6 here. Is this an appeal to emotion or logic? And I think the HSLDA is making an appeal to logic. I think they're doing a good job of making a logical argument. And I think that is to their credit. And I want to acknowledge that. And then I want to go to question 7, which is, am I focused on the speaker or the argument? And again, this is, if you remember a couple episodes ago, we talked about Zoran Mandami, and I encouraged you to not just be like, oh, he's terrible, ignore him, he's always wrong. And in this case, I'm encouraging you to do sort of the opposite, which is HSLDA is great. They're fantastic. But just because they're fantastic, let's go into their argument and not just assume that they're always right. And that leads us to question 2. Has this been tried before? Because if what HSLDA is concerned about is that government money leads to regulation, okay, there's a couple of ways to look at that. is the effort to regulate homeschoolers unique to ESAs? Because this argument is a lot stronger if the only time we see efforts to regulate homeschoolers involve government money. If that were the case, this would be an extremely convincing argument. But it's not the case. I'm going to read HSLDA's newest magazine, terrific magazine. If you are a homeschool family, I encourage you to join HSLDA. I'm going to just read from their magazine. This is legislative updates in different states. They talk about Connecticut. A tumultuous legislative season began with the introduction of a bill to require schools to report families who withdraw their child from school for the purpose of homeschooling to Child Protective Services. What? You're going to report me for not wanting to send my kid to your school? That's terrible. And anyway, there was some back and forth, but unfortunately, this bill passed and was signed into law. HSLDA said that they are looking at this law and looking at any ways that they can fight it. Okay, so here we have a case of a state heavily regulating homeschoolers. Is that because there's ESAs? Is that because homeschoolers have been taking government money and so now the government wants to come in and regulate them? No. Actually, Connecticut does not have a private school choice program. Okay. Oh, so Connecticut has no school choice, and they just had schools call CPS on parents who homeschool. Okay, so what we can see is that the effort to regulate homeschoolers is not unique to ESAs. In fact, it exists outside ESAs. And here's the other interesting thing that we see. Well, are states with ESAs, are they uniquely hostile to homeschoolers? Well, that sounds bad in Connecticut, but maybe it's worse in ESA states. No. This is from HSLDA's magazine. Idaho. A bill ensuring homeschool graduates are treated the same as graduates from public schools passed both chambers of the legislature in March with overwhelming majorities and was signed into law. Okay, so wow, that's a huge, awesome win. And Idaho has a parental choice tax credit program. It has a school choice program. Not ESAs, granted, but it has a school choice program. Let's go to Indiana. A bill protecting parents who allow their children a reasonable level of independence was signed into law this year. HSLDA supported the bill, which protects parents from criminal and child neglect charges when they let their children engage in ordinary, normal, and age-appropriate independent activities. Wow, that's another great bill. I wonder if certainly Indiana couldn't have ESAs, not if they're passing pro-homeschool legislation. Oh no. Actually, Indiana has 4 school choice programs, including an education scholarship account program. They also have a private school homeschool tax deduction. And to be fair, the HSLDA, they do support tax deductions that are not refundable. But here we see this disconnect. We have a state that has ESAs, that's pro-school choice, passing good, strong homeschool legislation. All right, well, let's go to another state. Let's go to Iowa. The legislature considered a bill to improve homeschool law by removing paperwork and restricting the ability of the Department of Education to impose additional rules for homeschooling. That unfortunately didn't pass, but Iowa is another state with wait for it, education savings accounts. Now, I don't believe homeschool families are eligible in Iowa for ESAs, but anyway, it's just interesting to see this, okay? Because what you're going to see time and time again is that there are states with no school choice programs going after homeschoolers, and there are states with strong, expansive school choice programs working to protect homeschoolers. Now, what explains this disconnect? What do you think? Let's have a pause point. What explains the disconnect? Here is the thing. The challenge that the thing that I think most homeschoolers want, most homeschool families want, most people want, is to focus on their own family, is to focus on their own children, to say, okay, let me do my thing, you do your thing, and we'll be cool, right? I'm not bugging you. I'm not asking for anything from the government. I just want the freedom to educate my own kids. And here's the problem. That world simply doesn't exist. The world where you just get to wash your hands of everything and then everything stays okay. That's not how the world is, because there are people who on principle disagree with you homeschooling. They don't want people to be able to homeschool. They don't want my wife and I to be able to educate some of our children here in our home. And they aren't going to stop. And so whether or not there are ESAs, this threat is still going to be there. In other words, it's not, ESAs do not create a unique threat to homeschooling, because the reason people oppose homeschooling is not because they're so concerned about every government dime being spent well. If they were, they would go right to the public schools, but they want to stop homeschoolers. And so in some cases, is the excuse they use to stop homeschoolers, oh, well, we just have to have accountability for this, the ESA money. Yes, that is absolutely sometimes the excuse they use. But just because you take away that excuse doesn't mean you're going to stop them from their pursuit. And don't take my word for it. Here's what the HSLDA says. The bills introduced this year in Hawaii, West Virginia, Nebraska, Connecticut, and elsewhere reflect a belief among some lawmakers and advocacy groups that parental authority over education is a problem to be managed rather than a right to be protected. Okay, so this is the fundamental problem, is that there are people in our country and around the world who do not believe in parental authority, who do not believe in parental autonomy. They believe that children, at least their education, belongs to the state. This is HSLDA. That assumption surfaces every session in new states under new names, and it will surface again. You can't escape this, homeschoolers. You can't just bury your heads in the sand and say, I don't want anything from you, stay away. These people are not going to stay away from you. Okay, and so if they're not going to stay away, then how is it best to fight back? It's best to fight back with a massive coalition of people who have the same interest. HSLDA brags, rightfully so, about how they and the homeschool community turns out en masse to fight homeschool regulations. Sometimes it's enough, sometimes it's not. What ESAs provide is a larger coalition of people who are working toward the same end as you, which is less government regulation in education, more parental control in education. All right, and this brings us to the second objection, the principled objection that HSLDA has to school choice. But before we get there, let me tell you about a terrific book, especially for teens. It's called Memory Burn by J.T. Lindstrom. It's set in a dystopian future where AI definitely hasn't improved the world. Memory Burn has terrific action sequences and memorable characters like Elias Vane. He's a smuggler who takes a no-question-asked job that, you guessed it, leads to lots of questions, especially about his past. You see, the AI that runs the world has optimized humans by erasing their memories. I really enjoyed this book. I stayed up way too late one night reading it, and both of my teenage children enjoyed it as well. Check out Memory Burn today. All right. So the HSLDA has a deeper, more fundamental objection to school choice, and this is articulated, again, in the same magazine by HSLDA by Amy Buckmeyer. And here's what she says. For much of American history, education was understood as a parental responsibility. Families taught their children at home, apprenticed them, pooled resources in small community schools, or hired tutors when they could afford it. There was variety, but there was also an assumption. Parents were in charge. That assumption began to shift in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the rise of compulsory school attendance laws. These laws were often motivated by genuine concerns, child labor, immigration, literacy, and social cohesion, but they carried with them a quiet reordering of authority. Education was no longer something parents provided with the help of the community. It became something the state enforced. Over time, public education didn't just become common, it became default. A little later, by the middle of the 20th century, the assumption was firmly in place. The state was responsible for education, and parents participated by enrolling their children in improved institutions. Here's how James Mason, HSLDA president, put it. Tax-funded ESAs are premised on the notion that the education of children is primarily a state responsibility based on the interests of the state. Those interests shift from time to time, as evidenced by the long sweep of secularization, and social engineering. All right, let's have a pause point. If you don't want the government to provide something essential, does that mean you oppose it? What do you think? Well, I don't want the government to provide food or clothing for my family or transportation. That doesn't mean that I oppose those things. In fact, I think those things are very important, and they're so important, I don't trust the government with them. Okay, what you're going to see a lot of times is if you follow political discussion, you'll get this kind of false dichotomy from the left. Either you want the government to do it or you don't want it to be done at all. No, there's a whole nother option in there where people do it for themselves. And if you look at the cost of the things the government runs versus the cost of the things the private sector runs, the private sector does a much better job in almost every instance. So don't let the left come and say, well, if you don't support the government doing it, then you support nothing. No, there is this whole middle ground. Education is very important. And in fact, it's so important that I think there's a lot of validity to what HSLDA says about, wouldn't it be better if parents were responsible? Don't you think our literacy rates, I think our proficiency rates in reading would be greater than 50%? Don't you think that parents would make sure that their child graduate high school being able to read well instead of just assuming, well, they're getting A's and B's, so everything must be great? Yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to that argument. Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's assume that we should return to the original model of parents being responsible for their own children's education. How are you going to do that? Let's have a pause point. That's the question I want to ask. For the sake of argument, let's assume that we should return to the original model of parents, not government, being responsible for their own child's education. How do you get there? All right, well, you might just say, well, let's pass a law. Nope, not gonna cut it. This is a 2020 report from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. Every state constitution includes language that mandates the establishment of a public education system. Okay, do you understand that? Every state constitution requires a public education system. So you can want to get back to the world of 1750, of 1800, where parents were directly responsible for their child's education. We can even understand some of the strengths and the reasons, and could even make a strong argument that actually education would be better without the government. But we have a major practical problem. Every state constitution requires a public education system. In general, you need about 2/3 of voters to support a constitutional amendment, or 2/3 of legislators. That's massive, overwhelming support for a constitutional amendment. How are you going to get there? Well, let's see. Let's ask question one of what happens next. We have a current system where the public education system educates, 80 to 85% of students. By and large, teaches children to hate America, to hate Christianity, teaches dependence on government, leaves them incapable of doing things like reading well or, making change. Okay, so that's the system we've had. We've had that for decades. What happens next? Well, those students leave the system, they become voters, and they're going to vote to remove the education requirement from state constitutions. No, they're not, because they've been trained, they've been indoctrinated to, in many cases, hate America, to hate Christian virtue, to not trust people to be able to do things on their own, and they become the voters. So our public school system is not turning out students who love America, who have learned this history like the HSLDA lays out. And so it's not great when you live in a country that elects its leaders. And so how would you, if this was your goal, was to return education fully to parents, how would you get there? How would you get there where a populace wanted and was willing to amend its constitution to remove the requirement for public education? How would you get voters like that? Well, you cannot get them by allowing them to stay in the public schools. Just look at what young people believe after they have spent the majority of their lives in those schools. You know what you need? You need school choice. You need more homeschoolers. And ESAs are what allow people to do this. Okay, and so when James Mason says tax-funded ESAs are premised on the notion that the education of children is primarily a state responsibility based on the interest of the state. Okay, I think he is misstating this. Tax-funded ESAs are premised on the notion that if the state is going to provide an education, which it is much better to have that education directed by parents than by state bureaucrats. And if you ever want to get to a point where the public in large, the public in mass understands these first principles, you can't leave them in traditional public schools. Now, look, I am not going to say that the Bible gives a clear answer on this. I do not believe it does. And certainly many of the people with HSLDA are strong Christians. But I am reminded in this discussion of something that happens in Esther 4. Mordecai goes to Esther, or through a servant, and says, the king, hey, by the way, the king's going to kill all the Jews. And Esther says, okay, great. I'd love to help, but, I'm not sure what I can do. I haven't really been called by the king. And here's what Mordecai says. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your families will perish. Father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And so this is the mistake I think homeschoolers are making when they oppose school choice. They're thinking that if we just stay away, if we just don't ask anything of the government, we'll escape the government. You are not going to escape the government, because as the HSLDA itself lays out, the fundamental disagreement is not about a wise use of taxpayer funds. It's about whether parental authority over education is a problem to be managed or a right to be protected. And if you are having that battle, you do not want the vast majority of children going to schools that teach them that parental authority over education is a problem to be managed. You don't want that. You want them to be able to escape those schools. You want more students to be able to be educated by their parents, to learn about American history. Homeschoolers are right to worry about government intrusion, but that intrusion will only grow more intense when 80 to 85% of students are indoctrinated in traditional public schools. Don't just protect your right to homeschool. Take steps to build a coalition of parents who are invested in their child's education. Take steps to ensure more students receive a strong education. Don't just protect your right to homeschool. Protect your children and your grandchildren's right to homeschool as well. Let's have a final pause point. Who do you agree with more? And I really enjoy this discussion because I think there is an opportunity to disagree on the right, and to see, well, what are the strengths of that argument versus strengths of this argument. And oftentimes what you'll see is, if you step back and look at this argument, it's not even so much a disagreement about the destination. It's a disagreement on the tactics to get to the destination. And if you are involved in, politics, certainly, but if you're involved with a group that's creating something, you're oftentimes going to have these types of disagreements. And when you do, I encourage you to think through the other side's arguments. Doesn't mean the other side is right, but understand the strengths of their argument, but then also understand how your arguments respond to theirs. I hope you've been able to do that today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube or share it with a friend. If you have homeschoolers, I know this is a big topic of conversation among homeschoolers. If you would like some homeschoolers, to get the other side of the conversation, send them this episode. Be courageous like Charlie, stay sharp, and give God the glory. I'll see you next time.